My husband stepped into the shower and left his phone face up on the bathroom vanity. I wasn't snooping. I had come upstairs to bring him a fresh towel, the thick white ones from the linen closet he always forgot to grab himself. 34 years of marriage and he still forgot. I set the towel on the hook beside the door, and that's when the screen lit up. I wasn't trying to read it, but the message was right there, bright and impossible to miss in the gray November morning light. 3 words. Miss you already. The sender's name I recognized immediately. She was the junior associate who had joined my husband's architectural firm 8 months ago. He had mentioned her to me exactly once, saying she was sharp, enthusiastic, and asking the right questions. I had smiled and said that sounded promising for the firm. I read the message twice. Then I set his towel on the hook, walked downstairs to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for it to boil. I stood at the window looking out at the backyard, at the oak tree we had planted together the year our son was born. The leaves were all gone by then, just bare branches against a white sky. By the time my husband came downstairs in his pressed shirt, smelling of the cedar soap I had bought him for his birthday, I had already decided exactly what I was going to do. I did not confront him that morning. I smiled and handed him his coffee and asked if he wanted toast. He said he wasn't hungry, kissed my cheek, and left for the office. I stood at the front window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and let myself feel it for exactly 10 minutes. That was all I allowed. 10 minutes of shaking hands and a throat so tight I couldn't swallow. 10 minutes of 34 years flipping through my mind like pages in a book someone was tearing out one by one. After those 10 minutes, I picked up my phone and called my oldest friend, Margaret. We had known each other since our first year at the University of Toronto. She had spent 30 years as a family law lawyer in Mississauga before retiring 2 summers ago. She listened without interrupting while I told her what I had seen. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, "Don't touch anything yet. Don't confront him yet. And whatever you do, don't let him know you know." I trusted her completely. What I did not tell Margaret that morning was that the phone screen had not been the first sign. 2 weeks earlier, I had found a paper receipt from a restaurant on King Street West, folded inside his coat pocket when I was taking it to the dry cleaner. A dinner for 2 on a Tuesday night, the same Tuesday he had told me he was working late on a presentation for a client in Vaughan. The bill was $340 before tip. I had stood in the hallway holding that receipt for a long time. I had talked myself out of what I was thinking. I had folded it back up and put it in the recycling bin and tried to forget it. I had been trying to forget it for 2 weeks when the message arrived. That afternoon, while my husband was at his office on King Street, I went carefully through our shared accounts. We had always managed our finances together. It was something we were proud of, a partnership, or so I believed. What I found when I looked with new eyes was a pattern I had been too trusting to notice. Lunches charged to his personal Visa that he paid off himself before the statement came to the house. A hotel stay in October, one night, in downtown Ottawa. On a weekend he told me he was helping his brother clear out their late mother's house in Kingston. I pulled up the online banking on my laptop, photographed everything on my phone, and saved it all to a folder in my email with a subject line that said simply, "Documents." I had been a high school vice principal for 18 years. I knew how to document things. That evening I cooked dinner, as I always did on Wednesdays, roasted chicken with root vegetables and a wild rice pilaf. My husband came home at 6:30, hung his coat, and told me it smelled wonderful. He poured himself a scotch and sat at the island and asked me about my day. I told him about the volunteer work I had been doing at the library, the book drive that was running behind schedule. He nodded and said that sounded like a lot of work. He seemed perfectly relaxed. Not guilty, not careful, just relaxed in the way that a man is relaxed when he believes he has not been caught. I watched him eat dinner and talk about a building renovation project downtown, and I felt the strange, cold clarity of someone who already knows the verdict and is simply waiting for the trial to conclude. 3 days later, I was ready. I picked up my husband's phone while he was in the backyard raking the last of the leaves. His passcode was our wedding anniversary, June 17th. The kind of irony that makes your stomach turn. I opened the messages. The conversation with the young woman was long, months of it, terms of endearment, plans. Inside jokes I didn't understand because they belonged to a life he had built alongside ours, just out of my sight. I photographed every screen. I kept my hands steady. When I heard the back door open, I set the phone exactly where I had found it and went to refill the kettle. He came inside tracking leaves on the floor I had just cleaned. I handed him a paper towel and asked if he wanted tea. That weekend, my husband went to what he told me was a Saturday morning client meeting. I knew by then that he rarely had client meetings on Saturdays. When his car turned the corner at the end of our street, I picked up his phone, which he had left on the kitchen counter while grabbing his jacket, and I opened the messages. She had texted him while he was getting ready. "Can't wait to see you. Should I bring anything?" My fingers were steady. I typed back, not as him, but with full knowledge of what I was doing. "Actually, change of plans. Come to the house. My wife is visiting her sister in Hamilton today. We'll have the place to ourselves." Her response came in under a minute. A string of happy face emojis and, "On my way. Give me an hour." I took a screenshot. I sent it to my own phone. Then I deleted every trace from his phone and set it back on the counter at the exact same angle. I went upstairs, changed into a blouse I liked, put on a pair of earrings, and came back down to wait. My husband returned at 11:15, surprised to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the Saturday Globe and Mail. I told him I had decided not to drive to Hamilton after all. The weather looked uncertain. He said something vague about that being probably a good idea and went to hang up his coat. He was quieter than usual. I let him be quiet. At noon, the doorbell rang. My husband was in the living room pretending to read. When the bell rang, he looked up with the practiced confusion of a man who had not been expecting anyone. I was already on my feet. "I'll get it," I told him. My voice was even and quiet. I walked to the front door of our house, the house where we had raised 2 children, where we had marked their heights on the doorframe in the kitchen, where we had had 34 Christmases and 34 first days back from summer. I put my hand on the knob and opened the door. She was younger than I had expected, and also younger than I would have thought my husband capable of deceiving himself about. She was perhaps 35, wearing a camel-colored wool coat that looked expensive, carrying a bottle of wine and a small box of chocolates from a shop on Queen Street West. When she saw me standing there, the color simply drained out of her face. She went absolutely still, the way a person does when their body has stopped receiving instructions from their brain. I looked at her for a moment without speaking. I let the silence sit between us. Then I smiled. "Hello," I said pleasantly. "You must be my husband's colleague. I've heard so much about you. Please come in." She looked as though she very much wanted to go in the other direction. But I was holding the door open with the particular calm authority of a woman who has spent 2 decades managing teenagers and difficult parents, and she stepped inside. My husband appeared in the hallway. The sight of her standing in his front hall with his wife beside her produced an expression I will not soon forget. His face went the color of old snow. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I touched his arm lightly and said, "Look who stopped by. I was just about to make lunch. Will you stay?" I asked her. I didn't wait for an answer. "I'm making split pea soup. It's from scratch. Come and sit down." She followed me to the kitchen because she had no idea what else to do. My husband followed because he was terrified of what would happen if he didn't. I gestured to the chair at the end of the kitchen table, the one that faced away from the window, the one where I put guests who weren't quite family. She sat on the edge of it with her coat still on, her bag clutched in both hands. I went to the stove and began ladling soup into bowls. We have a set of pottery bowls we bought years ago at a craft fair in Elora, deep blue-green, handmade, with uneven rims. Every guest we have ever had has commented on them. I set 2 of those bowls on the table, one for my husband and one for myself. Then I went to the back of the cupboard and found a plain white bowl, the kind you buy in a package of 4 at Canadian Tire for occasions when you need something and don't care about it. I filled that one and set it in front of her. She looked at the bowl and then at the bowls in front of my husband and myself and then back at her own, and she understood, not because anything had been said, but because some messages don't require words. I sat down and shook out my napkin and asked my husband about the project in Vaughan. I asked with genuine-sounding interest, the way I had asked about all his projects for 34 years. He answered in short, strangled sentences. I nodded thoughtfully and asked a follow-up question. The young woman at the end of the table held her spoon and did not eat. I turned to her and asked how long she had been at the firm. She told me 8 months, barely above a whisper. I said that must be exciting, starting out. She nodded without speaking. I said the architectural field was so competitive these days, it must take real dedication to get established, to protect one's professional reputation. I let that sentence settle. My husband reached for his glass of water and knocked his spoon off the table. It clattered on the tile, and he bent to pick it up with trembling hands. I said, so thoughtfully, "What brings you to this end of the city on a Saturday?" She said she had been in the neighborhood. She said she thought she'd drop off a small thank you gift for her colleague for some help on a recent project. The wine and chocolates were still sitting on the counter where I had set them when I let her in. "How lovely," I said, in exactly the tone I used to use when a student gave me an excuse I had already seen through entirely. I turned to my husband and said that he was very generous with his time, that I always told people he was the kind of person who went out of his way for others. I squeezed his hand across the table. He did not move. I could feel his pulse in his fingers. Rapid. Disordered. I began to talk about our plans. I talked about the trip to Portugal we had been discussing for our anniversary in June. I talked about the new deck we were planning to add to the back of the house in the spring, how we had already spoken to a contractor. I talked about our grandchildren coming to visit at Christmas, how the house would be full. I described the future in warm, detailed, specific terms, and with every detail I laid down, I watched the young woman at the end of the table understand more clearly that she had no place in any of it. She was a guest in the wrong house, at the wrong table, holding a bowl she had not been meant to keep. I turned to her again, pleasantly, and asked if she found the soup all right. I said it was a family recipe, my mother's, that the secret was to not rush it, that some things, I said, with a pause that was not accidental, take a very long time to develop, and they're worth protecting. She set her spoon down. I leaned back slightly and said, "You know, something has been on my mind lately. I've noticed on my husband's firm profile that his direct email is listed on the company website. I wonder sometimes if clients ever write to the wrong person, or if people ever contact him for the wrong reasons entirely." I looked at her steadily. "The firm has such a strong code of professional conduct, I understand. Very clear guidelines about client relationships and workplace behavior. Important to know those exist." She looked at me then, directly, for the first time since she had arrived. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. She knew. She knew that I knew. And she knew that I had planned all of this. The invitation, the table, the bowls, the conversation. She understood that she had walked into something deliberate. That the woman sitting across from her was not naive or oblivious, but had been completely in control of the situation since before she had even left her apartment that morning. My husband's hands were flat on the table. He was not eating. His soup was going cold. I took a sip from my glass and looked out the window. I said, almost to myself, that the leaves were all gone now, that the yard looked quite bare, that there was something clarifying about that. That you could see exactly what was there and what wasn't when there was nothing left to hide behind. She cleared her throat and said she really had to be going. She said she had forgotten about something she needed to do. She said thank you for the soup, though she had barely touched it, and she stood up, and her chair scraped the floor too loudly. She picked up her bag. She looked at my husband for one brief moment, and he looked at the table. I stood as well and walked her to the door with the same pleasant composure I had carried through the entire afternoon. She put her shoes on quickly, her movements slightly clumsy. When she reached for the door handle, I said her name quietly. Just once. She stopped. I said, "I want you to know that I don't blame you entirely. It takes 2 people to make this kind of mistake. But I do want you to know that I am not a woman who lets things go unaddressed." I said it gently, without heat. The way you say something you mean completely and have no need to dramatize, and I want you to protect yourself going forward, because the person who should have protected you in this situation did not. She nodded once. Her eyes were wet. She opened the door and left. I closed the door and stood with my hand on it for a moment. Through the frosted sidelight, I watched her get into her car. I let out a long breath. Then I turned and walked back to the kitchen. My husband was sitting exactly where I had left him. He had not moved. He was looking at his cold soup. I sat down across from him. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and set my phone on the table between us, screen up, showing the photograph of the message she had sent that morning, and the reply I had written, and the screenshot of her response. He looked at it for a long time. Then I set down, one after another, the photographs I had printed the previous Tuesday at the library, quietly, while the volunteers were busy with the book drive, the restaurant receipt, the hotel confirmation, the bank statements with the relevant transfers marked in blue pen, the screenshots of the messages. He did not say it was nothing. He did not say it was a misunderstanding. He sat with his hands in his lap and his head slightly bowed and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened." I said, "I do. And I need you to know that I have known for longer than you think, and I have spent that time making sure I was prepared. I am not asking for an explanation. I am telling you that I have already spoken to Margaret, and that she will be handling this for me going forward." He looked up then. He knew Margaret. He knew what it meant that I had called Margaret. I left him sitting at the kitchen table and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of our room, and I let myself fall apart in the way I had not allowed myself to do before. Not for long, but genuinely. My shoulders shook and my chest hurt, and I pressed my hands over my face and let 34 years grieve themselves for a few minutes. Then I washed my face with cold water, changed my earrings, and went back downstairs. I told him that night that I would be staying in the house for the time being and that he should make other arrangements. He went to his brother's place in Etobicoke. He called me 3 times from the car before he had even reached the highway. I let all 3 calls go to voicemail. Margaret came over that Sunday morning with coffee from Tim Hortons and a legal pad full of notes. She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair where the young woman had sat the afternoon before, and the contrast between the 2 visits was so complete it almost made me laugh. Margaret went through everything I had gathered. She told me the financial documentation alone was solid, particularly the transfers, which she said could be characterized as marital funds used without consent. She said we would start with a separation agreement and work from there. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "Eleanor, you did everything right." I was grateful to hear it, because it had not felt right at the time. It had felt like a performance I was putting on, over top of a wound I couldn't show anyone yet. In the weeks that followed, my husband called and emailed. At first he was sorrowful, and then he was reasonable, and then, when I didn't waver, he became briefly resentful, which Margaret had warned me was typical. His mother called me once, from Fredericton, and said things I had not expected from a woman I had loved for 3 decades. I listened without raising my voice, and then I told her that I hoped she was well, and said goodbye and did not speak to her again. At the firm, the matter of his conduct with a junior associate did not remain entirely private. I had not sent anything to the firm directly. I had not needed to. Margaret had contacted his firm's managing partner on my behalf in a professional and precisely worded letter, not to make demands, but to ensure that a formal record existed. In the world of professional regulation, a formal record has a way of changing things. The young woman, I learned later from a mutual acquaintance, left the firm voluntarily before the month was out. She was young enough to start over somewhere else. I did not wish her badly. I wished her wiser. My husband's standing at the firm was less easily repaired. He had built his reputation there over many years, and reputation, once questioned, does not simply return to its original shape. He stepped back from his partnership track. There were financial consequences to that, which affected the separation negotiations, which Margaret handled with surgical precision. Our house had been purchased together, and the mortgage was long paid off. The assessed value was considerable, as Toronto property tends to be. I was not interested in a protracted dispute. I was interested in something clean. We reached a separation agreement in February. I kept the house. He received a negotiated settlement. My parents had lent us $40,000 when we first bought the property, before my father died, and the documentation Margaret had helped me locate proved it unambiguously as a loan and not a gift. That amount came back to me first, before any division. My husband signed everything without contesting it. I think by that point he simply wanted it to be over. On the morning we finalized the paperwork, I sat in Margaret's office on a gray Tuesday and signed my name to the end of my marriage. Margaret handed me a cup of tea without being asked. She did not say anything. She knew me well enough to know I didn't need words right then. I drove home along the lake shore, which I never usually did because it takes longer. But the water was that specific deep gray blue it gets in February when the ice is just beginning to form at the edges, and I needed to look at something that had been here longer than my marriage and would continue to be here afterward. I drove slowly and I let myself feel how quiet everything was. That spring, I repainted the living room. My daughter drove up from Hamilton for a weekend and we did it together, listening to CBC radio and arguing cheerfully about color. We chose a warm sage green, nothing like the beige my husband had always preferred. My daughter stood back and looked at the first wall and said, "Mom, that's beautiful." I stood beside her and agreed. I called the contractor about the deck and had it built exactly as I had always wanted it, extending across the full back of the house with a section for container gardening along the far rail. I planted herbs in late May and tomatoes in June, and sat out there in the evenings with a glass of wine and my book and listened to the neighborhood settle into summer. The oak tree in the yard was fully leafed by then, enormous and green and completely itself. My son, who lives in Vancouver and had taken the news of the separation very hard, came to visit in August. He sat on the new deck on his first evening and looked at the garden and the yard and the light coming through the leaves, and after a while he said, quietly, that it looked peaceful here. I told him it was. He seemed relieved to see that I meant it. I resumed my hook with the library book drive, which eventually raised enough to fund a new young adult section at the branch. I started walking every morning along the trail near the creek, 45 minutes, which Margaret had been encouraging me to do for years. I took a course in botanical watercolor painting at the community center, which I was not particularly talented at but found deeply satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. Useful things and useless things both turned out to matter. One evening in September, I received a message through the library's volunteer coordination email from a woman I did not know, who said she had heard through a friend of a friend what had happened to me and what I had done and how I had handled it. She said she was in a similar situation and was frightened and didn't know what to do. She asked if I would be willing to speak with her. I read the message twice, and then I called Margaret, who was not surprised, and we arranged to meet the woman for coffee the following Saturday. She was younger than I expected. She had been married for 9 years and had 2 children, and was shaking slightly when she sat down across from us at the coffee shop. Margaret and I listened to everything she said without interrupting. Afterward, Margaret gave her her card and I gave her my phone number. As we were putting on our coats to leave, the woman grabbed my hand and said, "How did you know you were strong enough?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I told her that I hadn't known, that I had simply decided to act as if I were, and that the strength had come along eventually, following just behind. She nodded, and I could see something in her face beginning to settle. Driving home, Margaret said that it seemed I had a new purpose. I laughed and said I certainly hoped it wasn't my only one, and she laughed too, the way we had been laughing since we were 19 years old, sitting in a drafty lecture hall on George Street, thinking we knew everything and knowing almost nothing. I am 63 years old. I have 2 children and 4 grandchildren, 2 of whom are coming to spend Christmas with me in the house that is now entirely mine. I have a deck and a garden and a coat cupboard that contains only my things. I have a best friend who has known me for over 40 years, and a Wednesday walking group I have recently joined, and a watercolor class where I am the worst student and don't mind at all. I will not tell you I don't have mornings that are harder than others. I will not pretend that 34 years dissolve neatly, or that the grief doesn't catch you sometimes when you're not expecting it, in the middle of making soup or hearing a particular song on the radio. It does. I think it will for some time. But I have learned something in the past year that I want to say clearly for anyone who might need to hear it. Being calm is not the same thing as being passive. Knowing when to wait is not the same as being afraid. The most powerful thing I did throughout all of it was not the afternoon at the kitchen table, though that mattered. It was the 10 minutes I spent sitting at the kitchen table on a gray November morning with a cup of tea, not screaming, not breaking anything, just deciding clearly and quietly who I was going to be when it was all over. That decision is yours to make too, no matter how long you have waited to make it. Did this story stay with you? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you'd like to share where you're listening from, whether it's somewhere in Alberta, Ontario, the Maritimes, or anywhere else, I always love knowing who I'm speaking to. If this story meant something to you, a super thanks goes a long way and helps me keep bringing more stories like this one. There are 2 more waiting for you on screen right now. Thank you so much for being here. See you in the next one.